Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we are very lucky to have Dr. Mike van Graan with us, who is the coordinator, is the coordinator of the Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation, which supports the precarious theatre and dance sector. He has extensive experience in policy formulation and in building artist networks. So Dr. van Graan has produced 36 satirical and dramatic works, which have earned numerous awards and nominations. Most notably, he is the 2018 recipient of the Swedish Hiroshima Prize for Peace and Culture. And that same year, he was also awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Pretoria for recognition of his work as a playwright and as a cultural activist. So in today's seminar, Dr. van Graan will be speaking about South Africa and how it is a deeply divided society with inequality and culture being two of the key fault lines. And he argues that the theatre sector reflects these fault lines, both in the structure of the theatre sector and in the stories that are told. In this context, he argues that his role as a playwright is to make sense of the macro-micro and collective individual dialectics, and to put on stage in the public domain those ideas, perspectives, attitudes, and beliefs that may cause anxiety, and in doing so, provide a form of emotional and psychological catharsis. So this presentation will focus on his use of satire and humor in particular, and explores what it means to be a playwright in contemporary South Africa. So without further ado, Mike, please take over.
Great, thanks, Jenna, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the series on humor and positive social change. An early play of mine, Green Man Flashing, was prescribed by the Independent Examination Board schools, basically private elite schools. And I was invited to speak to the learners along with other local playwrights whose work had been prescribed. And one of the questions I was asked was why I chose to write the play in a postmodern style. I was taken aback by the question, as the form in which I chose to write the play was one in which, in my view at the time, best served the story and the themes that I chose to explore. So we write plays to be performed for an audience, but people who study them do so within the context of theories and labels, using academic scalpels, to which the playwright does not necessarily genuflect when creating. So by way of introduction, I will speak and reflect on the theme of these webinars as a practitioner rather than as an academic. The whole thing about being Dr. van Graan comes from my having an honorary doctorate, so don't take that as a kind of indication of any kind of academic inclinations. I'll leave the academic interrogation, language, and references to you. Some time ago, I did write a play, despite what I've just been saying. I wrote a play about called Some of My Best Friends Are Cultural Workers. So despite what I've just said, I would like to assure you that some of my best friends are academics. I haven't written more than 30 plays. I often get asked to run playwriting workshops or courses, but I almost always decline because I don't have any formal training as a playwright, and I've hardly read any books on playwriting either. I feel like too much of a charlatan to teach others. I've simply found ways that kind of work for me. So as a second disclaimer, in reflecting on my work and my process, such as it is, please don't see it as being representative of playwriting in this country. It's highly idiosyncratic, although certain principles with regard to the use of humor may apply to others as well. So just in terms of contextualizing my work as a playwright, as Jenna pointed out in the introduction, I understand the two key fault lines in the world today to be inequality and culture. Inequality in terms of who has economic, political, and military power, the hard forms of power, and who has cultural power, the means of soft power. In other words, exercising power by having people internalize and conform to hegemonic values, beliefs, ideological. Sorry, let me just ask this person to exercising power by having people internalize and conform to hegemonic values, beliefs, ideological assumptions, and traditions. The Gramscian concept of coming to be ruled by one's own consent. The second fault line, the cultural fault line, is about the different ways in which communities and individuals make identity and make meaning for themselves in terms of their beliefs and their values and their histories, languages, and traditions. It is culture that often informs the ways in which people understand, practice, and relate to things such as human rights and democracy, which are themselves premised on particular cultural paradigms, on particular values, beliefs, and ideological assumptions. I don't need to remind this particular audience about the inequality fault line in our country, but very briefly, the top 20% of our population earns 70% of the national income, with the bottom 40% having to make do with 6 to 7% of national income. Close to 55% of our population lives below the poverty line. Our unemployment rate officially is 35% of the national labor force, and 60% of our population are more dependent on social grants than on income derived through the labor market. So this essentially means that we live in a country of parallel worlds. Those of us in the more elite 20%, we may buy privatized healthcare, privatized education, privatized transport, and even privatized security, while the vast majority of people have to make do with generally inferior public services, exacerbating the social gaps in our country. We have a constitution that is universally lauded for its progressive clauses on human rights, but we do know how much different ideological beliefs, religious beliefs, different value systems, and so on, different ideologies impact far more on attitudes to rights asserted for women, for queer individuals, for people of different nationalities and the like. So these fault lines are reflected in all aspects of our society. And of course, theatre is not excluded. Some time ago, at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, I did some research into why it was that, given our history of anti-apartheid engaged theatre, there was so little conventional or mainstream theatre that dealt with HIV/AIDS that claimed an average of 1,000 lives per day at the time. The overwhelming answer that came from my fellow theatre makers was that this was not a theme that resonated with their mainstream audiences. And since they were dependent on such audiences for their box office income that paid the rent, the school fees, the petrol, and so on, they needed to do work that would attract those audiences or markets. Our national government spends 300 million rand a year on 5 theatres that we've inherited from apartheid: the State Theatre, the Playhouse, Backhoffs, Artscape, and the Mandela Bay Theatre Complex. And then they've added the Market Theatre to that mix as well. Theatre infrastructure that is largely inappropriate and inaccessible, that's geographically, financially, and culturally, to the vast majority of citizens, will also have the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts, as per Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But whose stories are told, who selects what happens on our stages, who has the means to purchase tickets, where theatre is produced, and for whom, all of these reflect the 2 primary fault lines of inequality and culture in our country. And just as there are power relations within our society, there are power relations within the theatre sector, and indeed, even within the production of a play. So as someone who has gained a degree of some credibility within the theatre space, I see my role now as an older person within the theatre sector, as providing platforms for younger entrants. While this may have a positive ring to it, I'm also aware of the power relations even within the production of my work, where a young actor is channeling, and in fact is contracted to channel my words, my views, my perspectives. But just as it's not necessary for an actor to believe the lines of the character that they portray, but they have to perform it to the best of their technical and emotional ability, so an actor is not required to believe or agree with everything that I write. Obviously, within the rehearsal process, we work through the script for the actor to at least understand what is being said. While theatre is an effective form for exploring issues and articulating insights and perspectives, my work as a playwright is a relatively minor tool for social change relative to where I spend much of my time in cultural policy, in advocacy, and building artist networks as means for bringing about the macro changes that really matter. I'm also fully aware, as per the theme of this webinar series, that humour and social change, well, the webinar series, the theme is humour and social change, that theatre and theatre makers need to be modest about our real contribution to change to the work that we do. At best, it can change perspectives and the minds of those who see a play, and this may be more possible through those who study the work. But a 60 to 75-minute performance has limited, if any, capacity to affect the structural changes that our society needs, which is why I believe that the arts sector needs to act in concert with broader social movements that are active in advocating and mobilizing for change. So against this background, and I understand and seek to practice as a playwright in examining the personal and the political, the dialectic between the micro and the macro, the individual and the collective. At the same time, I understand our country to be a democratic work in progress. We have not arrived as a democratic society. We are in a constant state of democratic becoming. As such, I believe that as artists, as creative practitioners, we need to be occupying the public space as well. For democracy will be created in the image of those who shout the loudest, have the most resources, or the most politically intimidating, or whatever. So I seek to do this work as a playwright in accordance with the following kind of principles, if you want to call them that. First, to remain rigorously independent of party politics and to speak truth to power, as I understand it, not just political power, but cultural, gender, religious, and other forms of institutional power. Secondly, to educate and inform in a society that is still deeply divided so that knowing and humanizing the other may be effected through the characters and the perspectives representative of the other through my creative work that is then put into the public domain. Thirdly, to provoke, or rather to catalyze debate, to go beyond informing and educating, and even to give offense in order to challenge dogma and even new emerging hegemonies. I am a proponent of after-show discussions, for example, rather than the traditional practice of come, see, leave, and keep your fingers crossed that something has landed with the audience. I prefer post-show discussions where learning can be deepened and individual changes of perspectives may be effected. Fourthly, to allow for catharsis, for emotional, psychological, and intellectual release by putting into the public domain and interrogating the kinds of things that people feel anxious or angry about, like Eskom, that has affected load shedding where I'm staying. This is why I'm talking to you in the way that I am. And then finally, to entertain and not simply to preach, but to do the above in ways that best allow change to take place, change in perspective, in attitude and behavior. And so this kind of segues into my talking about my use of humor. So what I propose to do for much of the remaining part of my presentation is to read from extracts from some of the works and then to conclude by summarizing based on these extracts how I deploy humor, particularly in the satirical reviews that I do. So the first piece is from The New Abnormal. It's a piece of stand-up commentary that uses COVID-19 as a pandemic, as a springboard for social commentary. It will premiere basically at the end of this month. So this is the extract. We banned the sale of alcohol during hard lockdowns to ease the pressure on the health system, but we make people bathe their hands in sanitizer that contains at least 60% alcohol. Now the most popular drink in Ventersdorp is sanitizer and Coke. My hands are so soaked in alcohol, I've had to take them to rehab. Hand Alcoholics for Health Anonymous. Ha ha. Hi, I'm Righty and I've not been sanitized for 5 minutes. Hi, Righty. My left hand didn't know my right hand was going to ha ha. It's like the ANC at the Zondo Commission. The backhand didn't know what the grease palm was doing. Ha ha. My fellow South Africans, I heard nothing, I saw nothing, I said nothing, I feel nothing. I thank you. Please vote for us. We are among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of consumption of alcohol per drinker per year. We have the highest incidence of fetal alcohol syndrome. Alcohol contributes 25% of hospital trauma admissions, 33% of suicides. I'm not sure how they do that survey. And more than 50% of murders and domestic violence are alcohol related. We banned alcohol during the pandemic, but we are happy to go back to the old abnormal afterwards. Let's drink to that. So this particular instance, humor, and obviously it's going to be performed a whole lot better by the person that actually does it, is used for a threefold purpose. A, to comment on the ANC's complicity, including Ramaphosa's complicity when he was deputy president of the country and of the ANC, in rampant corruption, as detailed in the Zondo reports. Secondly, to make a point about the impact of alcohol in our society and that it is not at all funny in itself. And thirdly, to interrogate the notion of the new normal, which everybody kind of speaks about, when in fact, what we had previously was abnormal. For example, inequalities within our society. So when we speak about the new normal, we should not simply be normalizing the abnormalities of the past, but recognize that what we had in the past was abnormal. In various sketches, I use songs that the audience knows and change the lyrics. So in the multi-sketch review State Fracture, I employed Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah to make a point about the Gupta brothers in some of the corrupting of the ANC's leadership. I'm going to try to sing a little bit of this, okay? So here we go. Our new country was doing okay. Then from the east came Oak Bay. We didn't know we entered a new age. Atul, AJ, and Tony, three brothers from overseas, saw us as a bargain in Africa. Hello, looters. Hello, Guptas. Hello, Guptas. Hello, looters. And then it kind of goes on. I'm going to sing the rest, but I'll recite the actual words. Gigaba made them residents so they could buy our president, and soon the country was up for sale. They sold off our democracy, clothed it in hypocrisy, said they were doing it for the poor. Hello looters, hello Guptas, hello Guptas, hello looters. The brothers, they appointed our cabinet and SOE boards like Transnet. The ruling party watched this all go by. The money flowed from the public purse to Saxon world, and then much worse, billions ended in Dubai. Goodbye Guptas, goodbye looters, goodbye Guptas, goodbye looters. And it ends with, this song has been made possible by the sponsors of radical economic transformation. So the use of the known and the recognizable and its subversion is also reflected in how I've tended to deploy Shakespeare. And so this is an excerpt from another piece where basically it's about addressing racism on the Cape Flats, something which is very rarely kind of spoken about. Often racism is kind of seen as between black and white, as opposed to people who historically have been classified colored and black African. So this is kind of how it goes. 23 years into our Rainbow Nation, our country is still torn apart by racism. So to build social cohesion, the Department of Arts and Culture is sponsoring a production of Romeo and Juliet to address racism on the Cape Flats. Romeo is played by Sandile Ndebele from Pinelands, and Letitia Abrams from Menenberg plays Juliet. Romeo. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? Juliet. Daddy, Romeo says there's some lighty breaking in through the window. Romeo. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Juliet is the daughter, Romeo, the bloody daughter. Yet is not some. This is not your Morphy play, Romeo. She speaks, so speak again, bright angel, for thou art as glorious to this night as a winged messenger of heaven. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that, Juliet? What do you want me to say after all that cuck that just came out of your mouth? What, sweet lady, says Romeo. Juliet. Refuse your name, or if thou wilt not but be sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a cap in hand, no longer white enough for the past, nor black enough for the future, but colored enough for this play. Romeo, 'tis but my name that is thy enemy. Juliet, no, it's your color too. If my brothers and cousins saw you here, they'll moor you. Romeo, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Juliet, maybe for you, Romeo, because you live in Pinelands. Here in Mannenberg, this is Daffodil Close. Over there is Marigold Avenue. Over there is Tulip Street. They all smell like piss. And even if I changed all of their names to Nelson Mandela Boulevard, Patricia de Lille Drive, or Rose Crescent, they will all still smell like piss. So this piece kind of like explores both class and race issues on the Cape Flats. Also goes to the notion of transformation, particularly for people in poor, marginalized communities. So changing the names of places is not about transformation. The conditions in which people live are exactly the same. Doesn't matter how you kind of are changing names. And I think what people are really wanting is for the substantial conditions to be transformed rather than the changing of names. The following is an extract from Payback the Curry, a sketch called the Helen Ziller School of Good Colonialism. You'll remember when Helen Ziller basically spoke about, things that colonialism brought some really good things, and she's a very good tweeter of things. So this is how this particular sketch goes. Dear subscriber, thank you for registering for the Helen Ziller School of Good Colonialism. Please note that this course may only be taken online and is conducted in 10 lessons of 140 characters plus or minus. Lesson 1. Thanks to colonization, you have the wheel. Without the wheel, where would Winnie Mandela have been with only a box of matches? Lesson 2. Colonialists brought the Bible. Without Christianity, Jesus would not return, and the ANC would rule forever. So thank God for colonialism. Lesson 3. It was Europeans who brought you guns and cars. Without us, you would still be hijacking horse riders with spears. Lesson 4. Why did the chicken cross the road? So that you can have KFC and Nando's. Lesson 5. Colonialism brought slaves. Without slaves, there would be no colored people, and we would not have Jonathan Butler, the Kaapse Klopse, and the Gatsby. So satire is also obviously about making people feel uncomfortable. It's not just one particular group of people that feel uncomfortable. It's about making people squirm to some extent with what is kind of put into the public domain. And in Payback the Curry, I also had a sketch that kind of dealt with the issue of femicide, and which featured Oscar Pistorius, and it was done in the form of the Oscars. And the actor kind of came in on his knees, indicating, that his legs were not normal in the kind of traditional way of. Anyway, you get what I mean. So, and then he spoke in quite a high-pitched voice, as in Oscar Pistorius, and this was quite soon after the whole case. And he read out the various categories, like vying for honors in the animated movies category are the following nominees: Tall Story, Beauty and the Beast, Despicable Me. The nominees for the best foreign language movie are Persona non grata, Dolus Eventualis, My Cellmate, Radovan Krejcovak. In the science fiction category, the nominees are Blade Runner Goes to Jail, Blade Runner Goes to Jail 2, Blade Must Fall. Oh, sorry, that was a late entry. The best sound effects category has 3 nominees: Screaming Like a Girl, Shots Like a Cricket Bat, Vomiting Like a Dog. In the horror category, there was just 1 nomination: We Know What You Did Last Valentine's Day. When constructing these multi-sketch reviews and as part of their development, I presented them to different audiences, recognizing that there is no one audience for anything, let alone humor. Different audiences respond to different impulses. So Payback the Curry, for example, was presented to an audience at the Franschhoek Literary Festival, then at the Makukanya Art Room in Khayelitsha, to a group of people in someone's home in Kenilworth, then at the theater in Delft, and finally it had a run at the Elmer Theater in Rondebosch. Audiences were not required to pay, but they were asked to complete a 1-page questionnaire anonymously, marking each of these sketches out of 10 and giving feedback on the sketches where they wanted to. They could make donations after the show if they wanted to. I would then evaluate these questionnaires afterwards, tabulate each sketch and their averages, as well as which sketches scored the most 9s or 10s. I would also sit in the audience with my script, with my my clapometer or my laughometer, and I would basically a totally subjective listening to how audiences were responding to particular lines, and I would record that. So afterwards, I would kind of reflect on this. What were the ones that were generating some kind of response, and so on. And based on these kinds of analyses, I would be able to throw out some sketches completely because clearly they weren't working with any of the audiences, or they were amended and reworked, also changing the order of the sketches for a different kind of emotional journey through the piece, so that not all, there wasn't a lot of laughter at the beginning, a kind of more darker thing happening in the middle and something like that. So it allowed me to kind of shape the whole, as it were. In a way, this was my form of market research, writing with my potential audiences, and it paid off, because by the time we premiered that particular show at the National Arts Festival, we had sold out our first show, because word of mouth had gotten out already about this particular piece. And then the word of mouth from the opening couple of shows at the National Arts Festival meant that the rest of the run was sold out. And of course, it helped to have someone like Daniel Richards, the most talented performer, to be doing it, and Rob van Vieren as the director, people with brands in their own right. But what it has also kind of helped me to do is to know where to place some of the more serious work. And sometimes it's kind of like sandwiched between two really funny sketches. I would do something that's a little bit more serious. So like this poem that deals with Afrophobia called Some Black Lives Matter. Thank you for inviting me to the annual Thabo Mbeki African Renaissance Irony Poetry Festival. I'll be reciting the poem, Some Black Lives Matter. Hey, brother mine, when next you decry those Afro-pessimists or reach for your blame apartheid card or feign victim heard for what colonialists wrought, remember this day, the day of goodwill, your king. Activist you, when next you petition me to march behind your banner declaring Black Lives Matter because some African Americans been shot. Remember this day as I turn and walk away. And you braided Model C poet with your naive Mother Africa poems drowning in a river of Congo blood, I vomit at your impotent words. As for you, taxman, when next you tax me another Madiba statue whose never and never again echoes hollow across this murderous land, I shall be the first to tear it down. You better lives for some. When you have done with your semantic dance of denial, spare me your empty Ubuntu bullshit. Save me from your social cohesion crap. It is a necklace burning our Zimbabwean, Mozambican, Somalian neighbors that speaks for you. You so-called leaders whose sons grow fat on African minds, whose daughters parade their African art, whose spouses bedeck your tables with African cloth while you serve African bodies on skewers of hate. Here, take my passport. Its pages are full. They are stamped with shame. And so, in conclusion and in summary, as a playwright in South Africa with its diverse audiences, diverse not just in terms of race, but in class, in culture, language, and so on, I use humor in the following ways and for the following reasons. A, as a strategy to make uncomfortable truths slightly more palatable for the recipients of those truths. Secondly, as a strategy to relax the audience before making a more potent point without necessarily using humor within the point-making sketch. In other words, with humor as a sandwich kind of on either side. Thirdly, as a strategy for dealing with and for exposing contradiction, irony, and complexity And then finally, in different forms as well, songs, poetry, character sketches, with form and humor complementing each other and to encourage memory. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mike. First, I want to commend your singing skills. That was exceptional. So good on you. Very brave. And also thank you for a very insightful presentation that was also very entertaining. So I have so many questions for you, but I want to let everyone else have a chance first. So I'm going to hand over to Andrea, and then she can just go to, I see there's 2 hands up there already, and then she can just ask people to ask you their questions. So thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you, Jana.
Okay, Mike, and I just want to reiterate, thanks. It was well, it was a quick response. It was too quick. One feels like you have to kind of think about these things and this array of stuff that you've given us to think about over many kind of days and hours and years perhaps. So I really felt, oh my gosh, I can't keep up. So it was in that sense a wonderful presentation. I'm very glad we've recorded it so that we can go back to it, and maybe there's a bit of repetition in there that one would need to try to keep up. But okay, enough said for now. I also have 1,000 questions I want to ask you, but I want to give other voices a chance first. So Zeko, I see your hand is up. You want to just put yourself on? There you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Mike, as well. I promise this is going to be a simple question. I promise.
Yeah, I'll just move you on to the next one if you ask a difficult question, Seko.
Lovely presentation, really lovely presentation. But I'm going to preface my question with a comment, right? So I'm interested in what you're doing with inequality and culture. And I'm interested as well in the role of the cultural worker in democratic formation processes in South Africa, right? And more importantly, having had said that, I'm interested in how, for instance, humor can be considered as something that is more private, more personal, right? And whereas, for instance, politics is in the public domain. And I'm informed by this distinction, or I'm informed of this distinction by the work of Hannah Arendt when she does that book of hers in 58, The Human Condition, right? Where she goes at length to distinguish between the private and the public domain. And the question that I have, Mike, is to say, how does your work, in terms of how you view it, how you use it, straddle those lines of both national culture building, right, in the sense of allowing us as South Africans to rally behind some of the pertinent sociopolitical critiques that you're bringing up, while at the same time allowing for a distinction, if any, between the role of satire and humor, because I think satire falls within that public domain of politics, whereas humor can be something a bit more personal, more private, and more individual. So I'm curious about how you straddle that line, as it were, of using the work for this national culture building project, but at the same time balancing that with maybe some of the responses that you could elicit from your audiences, who might say, well, that's a witty remark, but it maybe challenges my own identity as a descendant of white, liberal, English, colonial settler identity, or whatever it might be, right? So I'm curious about those, I would call them tensions, and how, as a playwright, possibly you negotiate those tensions in your work. I tried to make it simple, as I said, I did.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. So first of all, I don't necessarily kind of subscribe to the notion of building some kind of a national project, you know, because I think that maybe it's a kind of an aversion to this notion that we often talk about a national culture, a national identity, a national this, and I'm still personally not quite sure, comfortable with what that means or what that is. So I kind of prefer to see the work that I do as part of, at best, building a democracy through practicing democracy. And by practicing democracy, exercising freedom of expression and saying things that contribute towards contestation and the conflicts with ideas and so on. So it would be kind of from that premise. And in terms of the tensions that you spoke about, I think that's why I favor post-show discussions to deal with the kinds of anxieties that people might have elicited through the course of the play. And I recognize that within a play, because it's quite a limited kind of thing, and one sketch, as Andrea was saying, you can do a sketch and that can let people think for an hour afterwards, but before that even happens, there's the next sketch and the next sketch and the next sketch, and people haven't necessarily had the time to work through those things. So having a post-show discussion kind of allows one to maybe go into a little bit more depth around, you know, some of the meanings behind some of the witticisms, as it were. And then also, I mean, I think while you were talking at this notion came up that I've often had to also talk about, you know, I don't see myself as an equal opportunity kind of satirist or playwright, that because I now criticize the ANC, now I've got to criticize the DA, or now I've got to criticize the EFF. You know, it's like, you know, in order to be seen to be legitimate, that's the nature of sometimes our public discourse at the moment. You have to show your credentials in critiquing them in order for you to have the right to critique the other. You know, for me, it's about, as I say, it's about who happens to exercise power in a particular kind of circumstance. What are the things that are of importance then, and what is the critique that I'm bringing to it at that particular point. But recognizing that we live in a complex society that has these different kind of impulses, and so within a piece that I would do is to look at how within an unequal situation, an unequal society, how does the piece as a whole resonate with different parts of our society. But, you know, always, and always seeing the work also, Seko, not necessarily as being, and, you know, they're not complete products. So even once they've been through a particular run, for the feedback that I get as a consequence of putting it into the public domain, to continue to work on those pieces, where I think that, you know, some of the critique is valid, or some of the questions show that some of the things have not been particularly clear, and so on. So I also have obviously lots of more direct and personal discussions, and very happy to give my email to people afterwards, because I really do think that it's not about simply being this playwright that lives in an ivory tower that puts things in the public domain, take it as you wish, and then goodbye, I'm out of here, my work is done. It really is about, you know, if you are wanting to contribute towards people are having and embedding real substantial change, is working with them, you know, through the things that are concerned to them.
Okay, thanks so much, Mike. I see Vulindlela has his hand up, and the questions pouring in from all over the place. So Glenn would like to chat to you, and Isu and Jenna. So we'll just go in that order, and then as questions come up, I'll direct them to you. So Vulindlela, yes, thanks.
Hi, yes. Hi, Mike. Good to see you again.
Hey, Vulindlela, how are you doing?
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for your presentation. I just perhaps would like you to sort of maybe remark on the current state that we find ourselves in the last maybe 2-3 years. You spoke about discomfort. There's two things. Maybe this is a two-phrase sort of question comment. You spoke about discomfort, and I'd like you to sort of expand on that in terms of the artist's role, or the creative's role in creating a space of discomfort in light of a government or an authority that obviously might show displeasure at such. Someone mentioned the Sphere and Brett Murray's satirical take on Zuma. And also perhaps during, as a result of that, you know, the sense of the authorities quashing, these voices, and what sort of avenues we might have to sort of like move into to get more of a exposure to these discussions. And then secondly, the COVID pandemic also affected the space of, the critical voice. It affected how we saw humor. There was, I don't know if we had space for humor in the last 2 years. And maybe your take on that as to how people responded to the pandemic, and how people responded to, and how authorities responded to pandemics, to the pandemic itself. I hope I...
Yeah, Philindela, so on the first question, I think one of the things that we face within our particular sector is that the people in power don't come to the theatre. They don't come to forums where critiques are being kind of exercised creatively. So in a way, in some ways, and this is one of the reasons why I've tended to stay within the theatre space as opposed to going into film or television, which in many ways are much more restricted, that theatre is still a bit of a liberated zone. It has its complexities in terms of who makes decisions about what goes on the stage and so on. And there have been occasions when, say for at the Market Theatre, because they're a publicly funded institution, they've been worried about some of the plays that I've done, and the government officials serving as the government representative on the board has kind of said, why are we doing so many of these plays that are asking these kinds of questions? We should be doing more plays that are about happy clappy Rainbow Nation kind of stuff, So there is that kind of pressure, and that comes. But obviously, I think it's also. I've tended to, just as in my personal practice, look for the spaces where I do have the freedom to say what it is that I believe. And because I think it's an important part of building a democracy that we as artists do that. And I think too many of my colleagues, and this is something that we face all the time within the sector, too many people are dependent upon public funding from the NAC, from the lottery, from sources that they believe they better not say things that are critical, otherwise they're not going to access those resources. And that's a fundamental contravention of the exercise of freedom of expression. When we were lobbying for new policies post-1994, the whole idea of the National Arts Council was to have a body that was independent of government, so that it wasn't government officials and bureaucrats making decisions about who got funding, but actually a body comprising people from within the sector, experts who could make decisions based on the artistic merit of work rather than the political content. What has happened over the last number of years, though, is that body has genuflected much more to its political sugar daddy than to the arts sector that it's supposed to serve. So in a way, this is one of the reasons why people have become concerned about having a critical voice. So I do understand that, and I think it's a real pity. And so what we've been trying to do in some of the more kind of independent spaces is try to create the forums for people to feel okay about doing things. So in answer to your second question, one of the things that some of us did was launch the STAND Foundation during COVID because of the devastation wreaked by COVID on the theatre and dance sector. And so stands for the Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation, where we try to raise resources to create platforms and encourage work to be done, both during the pandemic and beyond, because those forms are always going to be the poorer cousins, as it were, because they're not seen as these creative industries that create jobs, that bring in income, that are sustainable within the marketplace. They always need some kind of subsidy. And one of the projects that we did was identify and then mentor over a period of a month 7 young women stand-up comics, and then create a platform for them to be able to say whatever they wanted to, in the context of GBV, but also just generally within the context of a patriarchal society. So I think that is like constantly, and what has happened over the last number of years as well, as you would know, Philindela, is that there's been an increase in the number of organizations that have come into being to represent the sector. So artists have tended to hold back in the past, and now they've seen, as a consequence of COVID, that their voice has been absent. They need a voice to be able to challenge policymakers, to be able to articulate their demands and the like. And that's a space which I've occupied, over the last while. So there's the space of creating platforms for people to exercise freedom of creative expression on the one hand, and then there's the broader space of advocating for artists within the broader democratic kind of society that we are trying to create, for them to have the necessary funding, to have the necessary access to skills, to have the necessary platforms to be able to do that. Otherwise, the constitutional freedom that we have to do so is something which remains on paper and not really exercised in practice.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm just reflecting on how during those last 2 years, a huge amount of money just went missing. And then the events and the performances that were being sort of put out were very much these sort of happy clappy sort of things, and trying to appease the masses in some ways, but also terrible quality. Yeah.
And a lot of that, which also, people were kind of forced in some ways to go online just to have some kind of a platform to show their works, but then there weren't the audiences for it. And just again, in terms of the theme of inequality I spoke about earlier, who had access to the online platforms was very limited in terms of the majority of people and so on. So all those kinds of questions that also, I think, were highlighted during the COVID period, and things that we need to be grappling with now as things kind of open up a bit more. But thank you very much for your
thank you so much.
Questions.
Okay, thanks so much. Glenn would like to, can I invite you up to chat, and then we'll, then I'll chat. I mean, I'll read Isu's comment, and then Abigail.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Mike. I won't be very long because there are lots of questions for you to still get through also. But my question is about, again, looking at it from a dramatic arts scholar, from the performing arts side of things. I'm interested in your treatment of the body and the voice. And you've demonstrated it in your talk today, the singing which you've done, the different types of accents you've done, the embodying of a particular character through the Romeo and Juliet skit, for example. And you're always aware of this, of course, as a playwright. And you've also, through your studying of your own technique and of theatre, as you've said, taking notes or listening to recordings of things and what kind of catalyzes certain types of responses from audiences. I'm interested in how do you make a judgment between how the body and the voice can work towards either provocation or the catharsis. I'm really interested in those two ideas which seem to shape your work. Thanks so much once again, Mike.
Yeah, so Glenn, thank you for the question. And it's I must say, it's something which I don't particularly have to grapple with. I've got the privilege of being the playwright. And the thing about theatre is that it's an incredibly collaborative kind of exercise. So I sit somewhere and I write the script and I test it with audiences and the like, and then I give it to a director and an actor to kind of portray and do. And they bring their talents and their incredible experience and their techniques to bear. So, someone like Daniel Richards, who's performed 3 of my one-person reviews, I wrote a piece of stand-up comedy once, and it was for Sivin Gezi who commissioned it, and he was unable to do it. And so we found Daniel, who had just graduated recently. And through the course of him doing this piece of stand-up comedy, I realized just how talented this guy was. And I said to him, I'm going to write a piece for you that is going to show your array of skill, that you can sing, you can dance, you can play the guitar, you can do a multiple kind of accents and the like. And he then did Pay Back the Curry, and he was just brilliant in it, and directed by someone like Rob van Vieren. And I never go to the rehearsal process, maybe once or twice before it opens. And if they invite me in, that's cool. I kind of leave it to them because they are really the experts in terms of bringing it, to the fore. And I'm quite often blown away by what I see on opening night in terms of what these interpretations have been. And that's one of the beauties, I suppose, of being a playwright, is to see how your work kind of comes to life through these multiple other talents, of creating the characters, creating the accents, creating the world through the designers, and what the director kind of sees that I might not have seen as the playwright. So it's then when I become aware of the skill that someone like Daniel has as an actor, that I'm then able to write much more freely. Because now I know that whatever I write, this guy is going to be able to deliver. So, once we did Pay Back the Curry, the next one I kind of did a show in which he had to be a chicken, and he played the part of a chicken, and then he had to be, a cowboy, and so on. So he just had that capacity, and I think that's what I've tended to have the privilege of working with, and finding people who have the capacity to give effect to the words that I write in ways that I haven't even thought about. So yeah, I'm not
Well, you
sure
do it
that's
very
exactly.
skillfully. You do it very skillfully. Thanks so much, Mike.
Yeah.
I appreciate
Okay,
it. And
thank
thanks
you.
for your body of work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Izuk is having connection problems, so he just wanted me to kind of read his question and comment. So he says, thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. It's truly enlightening hearing from a practicing playwright. And then he says he's interested in play publication. So apart from staging your works, can you elaborate on other mediums through which you distribute your work, especially in the light of the problems of play publication globally? I mean, do you have ideas on how plays can be made more accessible?
Yeah, so the reason why I got into publishing my work was because school teachers saw the works at the National Arts Festival and then said they would really like it to be studied within their schools. So Green Man Flashing, for example, came to be published, and a few other plays got to be published in that way as well. And so what I've done is I've created, I have a website, www.mikevangraan.co.za, that really speaks to my practice as a playwright. And then all the scripts that have not been published, they're available there for people to download and to use as they wish. And so, yeah, the major, I mean, publishing plays, you're not going to make very much in the way of money. And the only reason, as I said, I'm doing it is to make them accessible for people who study it. And I've worked with a small publishing house called Junkets Press. They don't make huge amounts of money either, but they're a very dedicated publishing house for contemporary South African work. So they do my work, and it's done at very low cost and the like, and it's to make it accessible to young learners to be able to have the text to be able to study. But otherwise, people are free to download my work from my website, and if they wish to do it, then they're very welcome to approach me, and I'll give them the rights, and we'll work out a royalty kind of rate, which is generally about 10% of some kind of box office income. And depending on if they're a school or an NGO, another kind of entity, they may get the rights for free, because, as I say, for me, it's much more important that the work gets to be seen and done than for me to be earning an income through it. I have other ways of earning income.
Okay, good. I was thinking, how on earth do you live then? But okay, good. I see there are another two hands up. Abigail has a question, and then we'll go to Jason after that. All right, I'm going to disappear myself.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for a lovely presentation. I also wanted just to say thank you. I participated in one of the workshops that Stan did last year with Empatheater.
Oh, wow.
And it was really a lovely experience. So also just to give you some feedback on your initiative there, it was really wonderful. Whilst I was hearing you give your presentation, one point and part of your own sort of reflection on your work and the processing that you have gone through that I found particularly interesting was when you commented on the journey that you went with Pay Back the Curry, and how you as a playwright had quite a rare and luxurious opportunity to sit in as an audience member in a variety of different audiences prior to the actual performance kind of debuting. So during that process, am I correct in saying that you were then still making edits to the play text whilst you were sitting in as the audience member?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that was the reason why I was doing it. It was like part of my market research about the script, yeah.
So the play was still sort of kind of being workshopped. You did have performers, they were in a rehearsal process. Did you perform the same play to each audience, or did you make edits as you went along?
Both. So there were times that the performances, because they had to be organized beforehand, were too close to each other for there to be any kind of changes. And it was also something which I did with the actor and the director. In fact, I had to write it into their contract because they never worked in that way before. Okay. That, hey, there may very well be changes and that you are going to have to possibly re-rehearse things. And it's very difficult for an actor. I mean, you've like been through a rehearsal process, a 3-week rehearsal process. You've arrived at a particular point. And now the playwright says to you, actually, you know, based on these kinds of responses, I've rethought this particular work, so I'm changing it in this particular way. Please, can you re-rehearse it? unlearning a whole bunch of lines and redoing a whole bunch of new lines is a challenging thing. It's more difficult than to learn a new script offhand. And yet that became a way in which we worked over the course of 3 different editions of these productions. And the final products were better for it. So it might have been exacting and difficult and not the usual way of working for Rob and Daniel, but it became, they saw the value of it in terms of, you know, what the eventual outcomes were.
Because I think what I was thinking at that, when you were speaking about it, being present as an audience member, also sort of in an evolving workshopping play, and thinking about the kind of title of the seminar about social cohesion and humor, that you also were quite aware to the moments of humor, and you even recorded that laughter and the audience laughing. That from a kind of research lens, I find that moment really interesting, in that you were placed and present in that moment of humor and humor arousing. And you actually were given this fortunate opportunity of being present in what we would say is quite a good sample pool. It was really diverse. And in a way, you were then getting a lens as to what is the social cohesion, how is humor creating social cohesion, and from your own self-reflective vantage, what was your kind of take home as to how was humor or wasn't humor bringing social cohesion?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And maybe as you were talking, I was thinking maybe I need to be doing this more with an academic by my side, you know, someone who like follows the dialogue and does the research. I was kind of doing this kind of work very much on the basis of what is it that the final product is going to be that will speak to the widest possible range of audiences, so that it wouldn't just be for that particular audience or that particular audience, but that there would be something in it for a range of people. I wouldn't have to redo the script because that's not practical, you know, depending on which audience I was going into. So it really was trying to find, and also because, you know, I find that post 1994, the theatre world is still very divided in some ways along who goes to see what piece of theatre, and it's very divided along the old kind of apartheid classifications, you know, so this kind of people goes and see Mark Lottering, those people go and see Afrikaans theatre, and so on. And what I'm trying to do, and maybe going back to Saseko's initial question, if I have a national kind of project in mind, it's about bringing people into the theatre that represents a cross-section of our society. So the characters that I try to have within the pieces should be represented in that cross-section as well. And so part of the research that you've described that I've done is also about making sure that where I do have characters that I've created that resonate with particular communities or that are reflecting those communities, that I'm doing it in a way that's authentic, that resonates with them, that they are responding to, that I'm not doing things in ways that are offensive in the negative sense of the word. I don't mind offending people if it's about truth. I do mind offending people if it's because I've not done, you know, adequate kind of research into particular things, or are using stereotypes or whatever. So that are purposefully that are just negative. So maybe just to answer your question, there was that sketch that I referred to earlier about the Oscar Pistorius one, the Oscars. When we did it for a primarily white audience, there was complete and utter silence. It was like, too soon, you cannot be making this kind of commentary using this right now. Whereas when I took the same piece to Makakanya Art Room in Khayelitsha, the responses were like, ha, 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 you know, like just, and then I kind of did another piece where I showed the work and I took out that sketch completely and played it to another audience where there happened to be some people who had been at the Makakanya Art Room who said, why did you take that sketch out? We missed that sketch. So then it kind of came back, but it came back with a little bit of tweaking so that the links between that sketch and femicide were kind of just made a lot clearer, that it wasn't just something to elicit that people thought was to get a few cheap laughs, as it were. So yeah, I think that sketch probably is an example of the kind of thing that you're asking about. What are the things that speak to different audiences in different ways? And it's a question I was going to ask Aseko using these philosophy hat, maybe you can talk about that at some point. It's the question that, you know, other people kind of get kept awake at night. Why do Black people laugh at things that other people find offensive or really hurtful, you know? And so part of my doing this kind of research was about making sure that I, at least as a playwright and producer, understood what things were resonating with different audiences. What were the things that people were finding difficulty with, and how do I then address that if it does need to be addressed, you know, from the point of view of the bigger picture of where I wanted the pieces to land, as opposed to simply doing things for their own sake.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. That was, I mean, this conversation could go on forever. It's so fascinating. Unfortunately, we're starting to kind of run out of time. So I just want to give Jason a minute or two to kind of, it'll be our last question, I'm afraid. And then, yeah, we'll have to unfortunately wrap up.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Mike. So this actually resonates with what you just said and with what Siseka as well. Is when you were talking about having this humbler project than nation building, it made me think of Ivor Chipkin had a book a few years ago called Do South Africans Exist? And his answer was no. But it interests me that I was kind of thinking back to when I was in the audience for Green Man Flashing, and it resonates with some of the other things you said, that the tone that it made me think of, thinking back to it as you were speaking, was the sort of McCarthy pushback moment in America, the statement of "have you no decency?" And that seems to be this thread that a lot of what you're talking about with satire is aiming to do. And I think what you just said is very interesting about the idea that the humbler project, which is, but it still reaches a very long way, which is trying to constitute an audience in that moment who agree about what is abhorrent or what is offensive and outrageous. And what you're describing is exactly what I had that experience of, that this idea of people collectively finding a measure where there's an overlap between senses of outrage and humor. And it's very interesting to me, the idea that that's a space that satire can accomplish something. And it's exactly that moment of clarification of, we are all outraged by this, aren't we, in some way or other. And I just wanted to say, I'm really fascinated by the fact that I wasn't misreading that. That sounds like a big part of what your project actually is, and why you're doing so much focus on audience feedback. And I just wanted to say that's interesting, as that kind of clarificatory moment can really resonate tremendously, even if we grandiose nation building stuff.
Yeah, Jason, that's very insightful, and you know, it's a really interesting thing in terms of how we worked in the apartheid era, where you knew what the story was, you knew who the good guys were, who the bad guys were, and you knew how the story was going to end. And so in terms of writing plays, I think, you know, people wanted the audience to think in a particular direction. That was it. For me, and interesting that you raised Green Man Flashing, because that was probably the first of my plays in which, you know, I was kind of beginning to recognize that in a way we are the society that was becoming something. So that rather than as a playwright, me saying, this is what you need to believe, or this is the direction I'm moving you into, I'm going to be raising the questions for you. So as you know, Green Man Flashing kind of ends, it's this whole thing about a woman who is allegedly raped by a very senior political cabinet minister. There's a trial, not a trial, but there's an inquest because someone dies at the end, and the woman is then brought to the inquest, and depending on the story that she tells, she will either go along with a complete cover-up, or she will bring down the house of cards. And the play ends with her saying, "Where shall I begin?" Which really frustrated a lot of people in the audience, because what does she say? What does she say? And that kind of almost exemplifies how I now see my role as a playwright within our society, that rather than saying, this is what you must believe, I'm going to be reflecting what I kind of think about a society back to you, and leave you to kind of make up your own mind. But obviously I have particular ideas, I've got particular feelings, but that particular play in particular, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's so good that it's been studied at schools, because it gives people all sides of the argument, as it were, the greater good versus the individual human rights, the juxtaposition of the violence against women versus the political violence in KwaZulu-Natal. These things that are kind of in conflict with each other. There's not one thing that is bad and the other one is good. It's about the moral complexity of a society that we are now engaged in, and how does one make sense of that for oneself as an individual. And so I think that for me as a playwright and in the work that I try to do is about, you know, trying to put into the public domain the kinds of things that are of concern to us as South Africans, however we define ourselves, so that we can, in the process, so rather than having a fixed idea of what it means to be a South African or what it means to be a country or a nation, it's about the process of becoming that is important to me at this point. And this is how I would like my work to kind of contribute to that. But thank you for that.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to abuse one last chance because a Parthian shot that just popped into my mind. Something that's been rolling around in my head is I haven't been able to get away from something I read the other day about how the correlation between emotional responses, smiling, making certain gestures with your face to indicate that you're responding to something is so culturally contingent that 300 years ago, European culture didn't associate smiling with the expressions we have. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about the stereotype of the face white people make while walking down the street when they're not sure whether to acknowledge eye contact or not. And the thing that's come into my mind is that all of these intercultural negotiations are ongoing negotiations. And that I just thought that framed what you were just saying again about how, again, it's this audience space where we're contemplating together, and there's something very collaboratively creative that the audience is doing that's catalyzed by what you're saying there. And I'm just really interested in how much that does what you're saying there. So thanks, and I'll shut up now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Jason. I know we have that feeling that we could actually be talking to you forever. There's just one thing that I do want to say in closing is that I don't think that it is fair and right for you to have called yourself a sort of idiosyncratic charlatan. I mean, if anything, academics are following behind you. I mean, the intellectual quality and the intellectual activity that you have to be able to write this kind of thing is you know, well, it's amazing to academics, and we follow along behind and try to get to understand it. So I think that you are beyond academics. Just saying that. But thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And yes, Jenna.
Yes, thanks, Mark. I had so many questions. I kept hoping that people would not put their hands up because I had so many questions I wasn't getting a chance to get to. So I will definitely, if you don't mind, email you later.
Sure.
Just with 2 or 3 questions that I'd love you to answer. And it's actually, Izu was on a seminar this past week, and he actually, on stand-up comedy, and he actually said, us as academics studying comedy or humor, we would have no work if it wasn't for those people doing the work. So in the same case with you, thank you, Mark, because lots of people in academia write about your plays and write about your work, and we can only do that because of the work you've put out there. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for that as well.
Thank you, really appreciate it, thank you.
Okay, it was lovely. I should just say next week we'll be speaking to Prof. Lydia Amir, and she'll be talking about how humor is now influencing philosophy and the way that philosophy thinks about thinking. So I'm hoping that will kind of, yeah, I don't know, show that academics do have some kind of contribution to make to this too. But thank you all so much. It was a wonderful seminar, very exciting. And yes, we'll see you all hopefully next week.
Cool,
Wow.
thank you.